Three strangers showed up behind my house, carrying chainsaws before 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning. And the strangest part wasn't that they were measuring my old oak tree. It was that they honestly believed they had the right to cut it down. I stood there with a cup of coffee still in my hand, staring through my kitchen window, thinking maybe they had the wrong address. But then one of them pointed directly at the trunk, unfolded a work order, and nodded like he was about to remove a broken fence post instead of a living piece of history. And in that moment, I realized something that would end up changing my relationship with my neighborhood forever. Because by the time this story was over, the people who ordered that tree removed would be staring at a number so large that nobody in the room wanted to say it out loud. My name is Daniel Carter, and for more than 20 years I've lived on Willow Creek Lane in a quiet suburb where everybody waves when they drive by and pretends everything is peaceful even when it isn't. I wasn't the loud neighbor who didn't leave junk cars in the driveway. I cut my grass every Saturday morning unless it rained, and I paid every HOA fee without complaint because I figured community rules were part of living together. The funny thing about neighborhoods is that they don't fall apart because of huge disasters. They fall apart because one person starts believing that authority means ownership. The oak tree behind my house had been standing there long before I ever signed the papers for the property. According to the records I later found, it was over 40 years old, taller than most houses on the block, and every fall it covered the backyard with enough leaves to keep me busy for weekends. My wife used to joke that the tree had its own weather system because whenever the wind picked up, leaves floated down like slow-motion snow. My daughter learned to ride her bike in its shade. My son tied a rope swing to one of its lower branches years ago. And after my father passed away, I spent more than one evening sitting beneath that tree with a folding chair and a beer, saying absolutely nothing, because sometimes silence says enough. To some people it was just landscaping, but to me it was part of the reason the house felt like home. Everything stayed that way until a new HOA president named Richard Holloway took office. Richard was the kind of man who never walked anywhere without a clipboard, never spoke without mentioning regulations, and somehow managed to smile while making everyone uncomfortable. At first I didn't think much about him because every neighborhood seems to elect one person who enjoys telling everyone else how to live, but then little things started happening. One family got a warning because their mailbox color was supposedly inconsistent with community standards. Another neighbor received a violation because his basketball hoop stayed out one extra day after his grandson visited. People laughed about it at cookouts, but nobody challenged him because paying a small fine seemed easier than starting a fight. Then one afternoon I opened my mailbox and found an official letter with the HOA seal stamped across the top. I figured it was another meeting announcement until I read the first sentence telling me that the oak tree on my property was creating an ongoing nuisance to the shared green belt and must be removed within 60 days. I actually laughed the first time I read it because I thought it had to be a mistake. The tree wasn't leaning, wasn't diseased, and it wasn't growing on HOA land. The only complaint listed was that leaves occasionally drifted across the fence onto common property during autumn. Leaves from a tree in autumn. I read the letter again, just to make sure I hadn't missed something, but there it was in black and white along with a warning that failure to comply could result in daily penalties accumulating until the violation was corrected. My wife looked over my shoulder and asked, "They're kidding, right?" I said they have to be, but deep down I knew people who take themselves too seriously rarely joke. That evening I walked into my backyard, looked up through the branches, and noticed tiny patches of sunlight breaking through the canopy the way they always had. I put my hand against the rough bark and found myself wondering how something that had quietly existed for decades had suddenly become a problem the moment the wrong person gained a little authority. Across the fence I could hear children laughing on the Greenbelt Trail while leaves drifted lazily through the air, and that's when I made a decision that would carry me through everything that followed. I wasn't going to argue with emotion, and I wasn't going to lose my temper. If someone wanted to fight me with paperwork and rules, then paperwork and rules were exactly what I would use to fight back. I just didn't realize yet that the truth hiding inside those documents would become far more expensive than anyone on that HOA board expected. The next morning I started making phone calls instead of making speeches because I've learned that anger burns fast, but evidence lasts a long time. and the first person I reached was a certified arborist named Michael Bennett, an older guy who had spent more years studying trees than most people spend working any career. He walked around the oak with a clipboard, tapped the trunk with a small rubber mallet, looked through binoculars into the canopy, and finally smiled at me before saying, "If somebody told you this tree is dangerous, they either don't know what they're talking about or they hope you don't." Hearing that felt like someone had opened a window in a room that had been getting stuffy for weeks. He spent another hour documenting everything, taking measurements, photographing the roots, inspecting the branches, and explaining that healthy mature oaks like this one couldn't simply be replaced by planting another sapling because decades of growth created value that money struggled to recreate. A few days later, his written report arrived, and buried among technical language and professional terminology was a number that nearly made me spill my coffee again. The appraised replacement value exceeded $180,000. I stared at that figure for several minutes because I had never thought of the tree in financial terms before. It was family history to me, but now I realized it was also a significant asset sitting entirely on my property. My wife looked over the report and quietly said, "Maybe they should know this before they send another letter." I nodded because I had no interest in turning neighbors into enemies if common sense could still solve the problem. Unfortunately, common sense and small amounts of power don't always live in the same house. Instead of stopping there, I decided to read the HOA governing documents myself. Most people never do because they're written in language that makes instruction manuals seem entertaining, but I visited the county records office, downloaded every covenant and amendment I could find, printed them, spread them across my dining room table, and started reading with a yellow highlighter. Hours turned into evenings, and evenings turned into an entire weekend until finally I found the section Richard had referenced in his notice. It mentioned nuisance vegetation, but the language was very specific. The association could require removal only when documented evidence showed a safety hazard or a condition creating actual property damage. Seasonal leaf drop wasn't mentioned anywhere. Neither was personal annoyance. I reread the paragraph 5 times because I wanted to be certain I wasn't interpreting it the way I wanted to. Then I called an attorney named Sarah Collins, who specialized in property disputes. She listened patiently while I explained everything and finally asked one question that caught me off guard. "Mr. Carter, has anyone from the association actually inspected your property with your permission?" I said no. She asked whether the board had formally voted to authorize removal. I didn't know. Then she laughed very softly and said, "Good. Let's ask them." Together we prepared a certified letter that included the arborist report, a property survey showing the tree completely inside my boundary lines, copies of the covenant language with the relevant sections highlighted, and a request that the violation be withdrawn immediately. Sarah signed the letter beneath my signature and added one sentence that still makes me smile when I think about it. "Any unauthorized interference with the owner's property rights will be pursued through every available legal remedy." We mailed it and waited. I expected someone to call within a few days to apologize or at least discuss the misunderstanding. But silence arrived instead. Another week passed before a second notice appeared in my mailbox repeating the original demand and reminding me that failure to comply could lead to escalating daily fines. It didn't address a single point we had raised. No mention of the arborist. No mention of a survey. No mention of the covenant language. It felt less like a conversation and more like someone covering their ears while shouting louder. Around the neighborhood, I began hearing whispers. One neighbor stopped while walking his dog and quietly asked if I was really cutting down the oak. Another said Richard had been complaining at meetings that the tree made the community look neglected because leaves occasionally blew onto the walking path. An elderly woman who had lived there even longer than I had leaned across her mailbox and said, "Honey, that tree was here when my grandkids were little." Funny how it only became offensive after Richard became president. That comment stayed with me because it wasn't really about the tree anymore. It was about authority searching for proof that it existed. Then came the Thursday morning I can still replay frame by frame in my head. I was standing in the kitchen pouring coffee when I noticed a white work truck backing into the area behind my fence. Two men climbed out wearing safety helmets and carrying chainsaws, measuring tape, and orange marking paint. At first, I assumed they were trimming something along the common area until one of them walked directly toward my oak. I set my mug down so quickly that coffee splashed across the counter and hurried outside through the back door. "Morning," one of the workers said politely. "We're here for the removal." I answered, "No, you're not." He looked confused and unfolded a work order. "We've been authorized by the Homeowners Association." I stepped between them and the trunk and said, "This tree stands on private property, and nobody has permission to touch it." The younger worker glanced at the older one and replied, "Sir, we're just doing the job we were hired to do." I understood that because they weren't my enemy, they were simply following instructions, so I kept my voice calm, even though my heart was pounding. "Then let me save you a very expensive morning. Whoever hired you does not own this land." The older worker scratched his head and said, "We were told everything had been approved." I took out my phone, showed him the survey map Sarah had told me to keep handy, and pointed to the property line. "See this? Everything on this side belongs to me. If one blade touches that bark, there will be an emergency court filing before lunch." For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The wind moved through the branches overhead, leaves fluttered onto the grass, and somewhere across the green belt a lawn mower started humming. Finally, the younger worker stepped aside and made a phone call. I couldn't hear the entire conversation, but I caught enough to understand what was happening. He said, "The homeowner says it's private property." Yes, he says he has legal representation." "No, we haven't started." After another minute, he hung up, looked at his partner, and simply said, "Pack it up." They loaded the chainsaws back into the truck, nodded politely to me, and drove away. I stood there alone beneath the oak, adrenaline still racing through my body, realizing how close I had come to losing something that could never truly be replaced. That afternoon, Sarah called after hearing my message. She didn't sound surprised, only focused. Take photographs of where they were standing. Save any security camera footage. Then call Richard. So I did. He answered on the fourth ring with the confidence of a man expecting to lecture someone. He began talking about community standards, shared responsibilities, and cooperation. I let him finish because sometimes silence is the best way to make another person reveal themselves. When he finally stopped, I said, "Richard, before we continue, there's one number you need to know." He sighed impatiently. "And what's that?" I replied, $180,000. The line went completely quiet. For the first time since this entire mess began, he had nothing to say, and somehow that silence sounded louder than every warning letter he had ever mailed me. That silence lasted only a few seconds, but it told me more than 10 meetings ever could, because people who believe they're absolutely right rarely run out of words unless they suddenly realize they might actually be responsible for the consequences. Richard finally cleared his throat and said, "Well, I think this should probably be discussed with the board." I answered, "I agree. Let's discuss all of it." We hung up, and 2 days later an emergency HOA meeting was announced. Funny how they claimed there was no urgency for weeks until the possibility of legal liability entered the conversation. Sarah met me outside the community clubhouse, carrying a thick binder that somehow looked heavier than it should have. She smiled and said, "Today we let the documents do the talking." Inside the room, the atmosphere felt different from every neighborhood gathering I had ever attended. Usually people chatted about landscaping or holiday decorations while coffee sat untouched in the corner, but this time conversations stopped when I walked in. Richard sat at the front table, trying to look confident, though he kept rearranging papers that didn't seem to need rearranging. The other board members looked less certain. Some avoided eye contact, while others politely nodded at me, as if they already sensed they hadn't been given the whole story. The meeting began with Richard explaining that my tree had become an ongoing nuisance affecting community appearance and maintenance costs. He spoke with the same polished confidence he always used. But every sentence sounded weaker than the one before, because now there were facts waiting on the other side of the room. When he finished, Sarah quietly stood, handed copies of our documents to every board member, and asked them to turn to the highlighted section regarding nuisance vegetation. For several moments, the only sound in the room was pages turning. One board member, a retired school principal named Linda, adjusted her glasses and read the paragraph twice before looking at Richard. "Where is the documented safety hazard?" she asked. Richard hesitated. "Well, the leaves create maintenance issues." Linda calmly replied, "That's not what the covenant says." Another member examined the property survey and asked, "This tree is entirely on Mr. Carter's land?" Sarah answered, "Correct." Then she placed photographs on the table showing the contractors standing beside my oak with chainsaws and measuring tape. A younger board member frowned and asked Richard, "Did we vote to authorize contractors on a private property?" Richard looked down at his notes before saying, "I believed I had authority as president." Sarah responded before anyone else could. Authority to manage association property is not authority to enter or alter privately owned property, especially when legal notice disputing the violation had already been delivered. The room became so quiet that I could hear the air conditioner switching on. For weeks I had imagined dramatic arguments and people shouting across the table. But the reality was stranger because facts don't need to yell. They simply sit there until someone has to explain them away. Richard tried once more. He argued that he acted in the best interest of the neighborhood and believed the tree would eventually become a problem. Linda folded her hands and asked one simple question. "Did you have an inspection report?" "No." "Did the board vote?" "No." "Did you consult legal counsel?" "No." Each answer landed harder than the last. Another member slowly closed the binder and said, "Then this association exposed itself to unnecessary liability." Nobody argued after that. The vote came quickly. 5 members voted to rescind the violation notice immediately. 1 voted with Richard. The motion passed, and just like that, the letters, threats, and daily fines disappeared with a single sound of the gavel. I should have felt victorious, but what I mostly felt was relief because I never wanted a war with my neighbors. I only wanted someone to respect a property line and the rules they claimed to enforce. 2 weeks later, a notice appeared in everyone's mailbox announcing that Richard had resigned as HOA president for personal reasons. Maybe that was the official explanation. Maybe it wasn't. People around the neighborhood had their own theories, and like every community, ours became full of quiet conversations at driveways and mailboxes. One neighbor laughed and told me, "Turns out that tree wasn't the biggest problem after all." Another simply shook my hand and said he wished more people stood up before bad decisions became expensive ones. A month later, I received a formal letter from the association confirming that no current covenant authorized removal of my oak, and that any future action would require proper legal procedure and documented evidence. I placed the letter inside the same folder as the original violation notice, because sometimes the beginning and the ending of a story belong together. Every autumn since then, leaves still drift across the grass and onto the greenbelt exactly the way they always have. Kids still ride bicycles nearby. Birds still build nests high in the branches. And every now and then I carry a folding chair into the backyard just before sunset and sit beneath that old oak. It reminds me that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes strength looks like patience, preparation, and refusing to surrender something valuable simply because someone with a title tells you to. But here's the question I've never been able to answer completely. If I hadn't hired an arborist, if I hadn't read the covenants, if I hadn't walked outside that Thursday morning, would anyone have admitted they were wrong after the tree was gone, or would they have simply called it another community improvement? I'd really like to know what you think. Was the HOA president trying to protect the neighborhood? Or was this a case of power going too far? And if you were standing in my backyard watching strangers start up those chainsaws, what would you have done? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this don't end when the meeting is over. Sometimes they begin with the conversation afterward. And if you believe property rights, fairness, and common sense still matter in a community, share your perspective and join the discussion.